Colleagues, it's very good to see you all here. This is session D. Have we got a rapporteur here? Excellent, thank you very much. Good, because I was a bit worried it was going to be me, and I thought I have to. No. I think I'd rather hand it over to a professional. Actually, thank you. More professional than me, I think. If you have. Tom asked me to produce a little bit of an introduction to this, and in some ways, I can do that and talk a bit about that. But I think the important thing here is that we actually get our experiences and our views together. But just to give you a little bit of a primer, the first thing I was going to do is to actually just read out the topics that we've got here. Quantum of recognition, vacuities of research measurement. Now, as soon as I say those words, we're kind of already in a particular ballpark, and we have a particular sort of understanding of what that means. The second thing is the commercialization of research. Academic freedom, its meaning in the new century, open access and its discontents, the funding of research publications, and finally doctoral colleges and research supervision, craft or mass process. Many of us here will already have a lot of experience of these sorts of things. I've encountered them both in my professional life as an active academic, as a sociologist, and also my activities as a trade unionist. I come across a lot of these sorts of things, either in abstract terms such as academic freedom, or in the actual nitty-gritty of talking to a university management about the imposition of a doctoral college and the way that it's actually working there. But crucially here, what I think we need to focus in on with a view to trying to come up with some useful questions that we can then take forward in terms of the convention is thinking what we mean by research, what the role of research is, and who the beneficiaries of research should be. And of course, there are the putative beneficiaries of research, which is this general idea of the public good. And I'd like to come back to that in a minute there. But in actuality, what we've seen for a long time, perhaps it's accelerated in recent years, is that the beneficiaries of research have always been capitalist organisations. I mean, this is what they've wanted to do. The expansion of higher education, set up very much as a public good in 1992, of course, was a means by which business organisations could defray their training costs, and they passed these training costs on to universities, and the former routes through an organisation like, say, BP or Shell or something like that would have been to enter the organisation, would train you up, and then you would have a career with them. They've lost those training costs by getting universities to do that. But of course, to get universities to do that, that meant that university degree structures had to change. And the kind of university degree I did in the mid-1980s is really considerably different from the sort of degree that I'm providing now, particularly with the focus much more towards skills, which is an interesting sort of shift. That's a slightly different debate here. But what I think we might want to think about is how we can shift the beneficiary of research, university research, back towards the public good. That's not to say that I want to trample on business organisations. I certainly benefit from living in a capitalist society, so I don't know. It's not that I want to abolish that, but some way of like trying to get the public good back to the connection with research. But the problem that we've got here is when you think about the other side of research is issues to do with structures and policies. We think about the research excellence framework. What we see is, of course, an operation in concentration and selectivity. And myself and many of the people probably sitting here who are of my age will remember back in 1992 the campaigns to try and oppose the introduction of the first, which was just a paper exercise or abstract exercise, research assessment exercise, and then subsequently it gained momentum. There was a lot of division inside higher education at the time, and many people were saying that we should absolutely have nothing to do with it. I'm still firmly of the opinion that we probably should have had nothing to do with it in 1992 and 1996, but here we are with our research excellence framework, which is still concentrating research into the golden triangle and still acting as a selectivity exercise to try and sort sheep from goats. So we have these structures that are very much working against the possibility of research being for the public good as we just move towards particular measurement targets and we just keep producing research for particular business outcomes. And this is replicated in the way that doctoral colleges have been structured. Firstly, the formal doctoral college process set up by Economic and Social Research Council, which was a vicious exercise in trying to ensure that nobody from a new university had any of the riches from the ESRC. And that was an organisation that was, an operation that was manipulated so skillfully and so brutally that I still feel personally aggrieved by the fact that I wasted all that time actually putting together a doctoral college bid when there was absolutely no possibility that University of Brighton would ever get this. And if you look at who the beneficiaries of the ESRC largesse, who gets to train social science PhD students, there are no new universities, post-1992 universities, got anything. And a couple of old universities, they're called, were also excluded, including the Open University, who I believe tried to take ESRC to court over this. Anyway. There's that formal structure of doctoral colleges, which again is being done so that you separate who will be the elite researchers with government, state-funded, centralised PhDs from other researchers who will get PhDs in alternative ways. Now, this isn't to say that PhDs have got a different sort of value, but of course the provenance of your PhD has a big difference in terms of your career trajectory. And that formal doctoral college structure is going to be replicated with AHRC and all the other research councils. They're all going to go down this route. And I think we can probably predict what the results are going to be. But the doctoral college internally also has a structure which I think is not one that replicates what academic values and academic freedom is about. Certainly here at Brighton and at many other places I know of in the new university sector, their own doctoral colleges that have been set up to oversee what PhD students are doing are set up in a way that maximises skills and minimises academic oversight of what's happening here. We've got a much more bureaucratic model emerging. We've got a model that is much more tailored towards achieving milestones and particular goals, and one that is actually diluting what is happening in terms of research. And I think that's something that's really quite concerning. What's happened here, the ultimate point where academics should have direct control and oversight of research is being eroded through the imposition of these external structures and by the imposition of particular bureaucratic structures. Now, as we go down the list, it says here something about commercialisation of research. I think we have to be slightly realistic here. Of course, research has always been commercialised, and it's always been for commercial purposes. But I think now what we've seen is an acceleration of the imposition of structures and an agenda that imposes commercialisation to a much greater extent. Certainly the Research Excellence Framework doesn't help us here in terms of just focusing on particular measurable outputs. So research becomes something that has to be quantified and has to be achieved in particular ways. And this is not a useful thing in terms of producing good quality research. But the research councils themselves are focusing on economic engagement. Many universities are also pushing this idea of economic engagement as well. In some cases, you might want to say this sort of makes sense. Perhaps business studies research, or maybe even applied engineering research might make sense. I think when you look at the Arts and Humanities Research Council and their focus on economic engagement and the fact that they look after, for example, archaeologists or medieval poets, it doesn't seem to make quite so much sense, but it's still being imposed at quite a high rate. So the research has always, well, certainly in modernity, in British society at least, or Western European society, has always had that component of helping with providing resources or providing skills or expertise for business organisations. Certainly, in my research, I look at scientists and how they work in laboratories, and a lot of postdoctoral scientific research careers, which has always been a real problem, particularly for trade unions to try and help people in postdoctoral careers, have always often taken the form of 1 or 2 postdoctoral contracts and then moving into the private sector. Certainly in terms of physics and high energy physics, one of the reasons that we got into the 2008 crisis was because many physicists couldn't have scientific careers, couldn't extend those scientific careers, and were snapped up by banks who then used their skills to construct algorithms which were then used to come up with even more sophisticated financial instruments that allowed the manipulation of markets and the marketization of debt and those sorts of things. So there's always been that sort of thing, but I think we're seeing research being attached much more closely to commercial outcomes, and that is something that, of course, has got major implications in terms of academic freedom. When we think about what research is for, what we might want to do is think about how we can retain or even regain the academic freedom that we have there. But what academic freedom is something that is really quite challenged. I think that point that was made in the earlier session about the connections between autonomy and academic freedom, and that these are actually now in an antagonistic position, is absolutely right. We're challenged on almost every front in terms of being academics and academic institutions by very powerful external institutions. Government, which is quite determined to back the idea of an elitist education system. I think it's, it's pretty blatant that the introduction of fees, the continuing splitting of the university sector into these two large groupings is designed absolutely to make sure that people from privileged backgrounds get a better quality of education, other people get a poorer quality of education, with a view long-term to eroding that. We used to have a convenient ideology in the 1990s of we are going to be a knowledge-based economy. I mean, that ideology and that fiction seems to have almost completely eroded. So, and the government have done this quite deliberately, because what they can then say is, well, there's no need to have universities if we're not going to be producing these sorts of jobs. We can rearrange the way that people get skills in terms of, like, much lower levels of things. And of course, the only thing that we can do about that is trying to organise and also trying to get across a particular message that it doesn't have to be this way. Now, that's quite a difficult thing to do, because as Harriet Bradley pointed out, many of the universities simply don't want to put their noses above the parapet. They really want to become business organisations. You can imagine if you're a vice-chancellor, you're earning £230,000 a year, which, may I point out, is £5,000 a year more than the Chief of the Defence Staff. So the person who's in charge of all 400,000 troops, Army, Air Force, Navy people, gets paid less than most vice-chancellors in Britain. And then multiply that by 110, which is the number of higher education institutions you're looking at here. I mean, there's something really quite disgraceful about that, but anyway, put that to one side. We don't want to talk about filthy lucre, but there's something quite bad happening there. But there's no incentive for universities themselves to actually start taking on these kinds of challenges. They've become self-serving institutions that can go on in a particular sort of direction. But that doesn't have to be the case for those of us who are inside institutions. And the open access issue, I think, is one that could be of great advantage to us. Now, I'm quite cynical when it comes to the idea of open access journals for research publications. I think that there was a fix that was taken a couple of years ago where basically publishers are just going to make a lot of money out of it. And again, open access is going to be used as a selectivity exercise. So if you are coming from a BBSRC or EPSRC funded grant position, you will have the funds available so you can actually pay to get your research put into a journal. This is how open access is going to work. So authors are going to have to pay to put it into the journals. If you've got the funding for that, that's fine. But of course, if you're in an institution like, say, University of Brighton, where you don't have much of those sorts of things, or if you're in academic discipline which simply is not driven by research grants, like, say, sociology or medieval history, then you'll have great problems getting into these sorts of journals. But we can do something about that. Open access doesn't have to be owned by Elsevier, Springer, Nature Group, or things like that. There's another thing that we can do, and we could go back to, I know it sounds strange, a kind of 19th century, early 20th century model where we could ourselves could start taking on journals, start running open access journals. Open access could be the way that we can actually formally get our research out to wider audiences if we, as academics and concerned citizens, get together to decide to publish these things in proper peer-reviewed open access ways. But our own open access journals could become vehicles by which we can reinvigorate that ethos of academic freedom and of what the point of research is. So we could use open access to try and get research back to tying into what we consider the public good to be. Now, I know this all sounds kind of quite abstract, but moves are already afoot by a number of groups of academics. We're starting one in my department at University of Brighton, where we're going to set up an open access, online, peer-reviewed, high-quality academic journal in the social sciences. And I think lots of other people are going to do this. So the challenge is there, but there is a possibility that we can find not just open access journals, but other sorts of things whereby we can actually start getting our hands back on our research and back on academic freedom. Now, that's my kind of initial thoughts. I hope I didn't go over my 10 minutes. I might have done that. But what I was thinking we need to do, and what I think our rapporteur will want us to do, is to try and come up with some ideas for the sorts of questions that need to be addressed and the sorts of we might be able to come up with some answers, which would be great. But I think just getting the questions together, the questions that really pertain here. And I'm going to put one straight on the agenda for discussion. It's not going to be the only one, but one that I think we should talk about straight away. And it's this: should we measure research outputs? I'm just chucking that one in there. There we go. How about that one? Okay.